Yeah, I'm not sure we could have chosen a much more complicated title, but hopefully it kind of summarises up what we're discussing here today and trying to link into that idea of leadership and actors and the particular link between social skill and certain voluntary sector tactics that we've seen in place. Just to give you a bit of a background to some of this, I come from a practitioner background. I am a former CEO of a children's charity. I then moved on to be a senior commissioner for 5 years for a local authority. It was those experiences that I then went on and completed a PhD, which was finished last year. And much of this research is about taking the research that we had in that PhD and with Jeremy taking it a step further in sort of, well, what can we contribute to the current debates? So overview of what we're trying to look at today is kind of that recognition that we are in a time of austerity. We know this is a challenging time for the voluntary sector and for third sector organisations, and that we recognise that relationships between the state and third sector organisations are often very contentious. What we were particularly interested in drawing upon in this research was that empirical evidence that was actually saying, well, we know that some are really struggling in this. We know that some organisations are really withdrawing themselves from that relationship with the state. We were particularly interested in those organisations that are successfully navigating that relationship. And we were particularly in that interested in this concept of social skill as developed within the strategic action fields theory framework, which I'll discuss a little bit about in a minute. And we were looking at actually, rather than considering organisations as passive recipients within this relationship, how are they active participants and also shaping the fields and the policy agendas? And so that's where we were trying to go with this. And I'd be really interested at the end, kind of your thoughts and feedback on the way we've interpreted and understood some of this. So, just a bit of background. We very well aware commissioning is that central to the political narrative, and we talk a lot about kind of some of those challenges of fears of independence, mission drift, voluntary sector voice and advocacy. There's a recognition of this ongoing turbulence, and we've got a lot of really valuable research that is taking this forward. And a lot of this was discussed at the last VSSN conference. A lot of these debates coming forwards. What we're particularly interested in is those third sector organisations who are deploying what we argue a range of strategies to help jockey for their positions. And I know Rob has done some work in this area and James has touched on this area as well. And it's building on that, of the ideas of actually how are organisations taking themselves forward in a positive way and working within this environment actually to their advantage. So, I suppose some of the background to this is there's a new narrative, and these are just some quotes from some of the organisations that were involved in this research that I think kind of help set the tone of that new narrative. And I'm certainly not going to go through and read all of them for you, but the one that particularly stands out for me and always remains significant for me was a CEO of a medium-sized voluntary sector organisation saying, this isn't the voluntary sector we once knew. It's a new and challenging landscape, basically a whole new ball game, and if you want to play, you need to learn the rules fast. We were really interested in this concept. Well, actually, the game, the rules, and are people playing a different game now? And if so, what are the strategies that they're playing with? Just to give a little bit of background on fields theory and the idea of the strategic action field. So particularly using fields theory to analyse this data, fields theory focuses upon the relational aspects between actors. And we heavily draw upon the understanding of fields theory from Fligstein and McAdam's work, a paper that they produced, I think it was 2011, with the book in 2012. And they define a strategic action field as a constructed meso-level social order in which actors, who can be individual or collective, are attuned to and interact with one another on the basis of shared, which is not always to say consensual, understanding about the purposes of the field's relationships to others in the field, including who has the power and why. And the rules governing legitimate action within the field. And we were really interested in this idea of drawing together the macro and micro elements of actors and organisations and how they were positioning themselves and their behaviours in relevance to one another. And within this, there is a assumption that there is a shared consensus within the field about a shared set of rules for legitimate actions, shared meaning, however, unequal distribution of power and resources. And so what you result in is this ongoing jostling for positions, which I think we can see reflected a bit in that concept of the game. Central to fields theory, and one of the kind of pivotal points of that, is this idea of social skill. Now, within this, we see voluntary sector organisations as strategic actors. And fields theory breaks this into sort of two ideas of the incumbents, those who are considered to wield the most power within the field, and the challengers, who are generally considered to have the least power and not particularly favoured within the field. And social skill being defined as the ability to induce cooperation by appealing to and helping to create shared meanings and collective identities. And so we were seeing this idea of kind of the implications of strategic agency and power, and this concept of ideological bias, i.e. what actors feel should be done, and those actors looking at how they can attempt to make that the dominant interpretive frame for that field. And it was that's what was fueling some of this research. Social skill tactics then. So in earlier work, Fligstein, and then in later work with Doug McAdam, had tried to say, well, what do we think these tactics, these strategies look like? And these were some of the examples that they give about the ability to frame stories, agenda setting, the adoption of these pragmatic approaches to situations while simultaneously kind of taking what the field has to offer, and the juggling of multiple strategies at once to position themselves within that. And we were interested in seeing, well, actually, what does this look like in action? Can we pull that out in action? So these were the prompts. It was the prompts for this research. So in terms of fields theory overall, from Fligstein and McAdam's point of view, they only consider non-profits sort of very much in passing. However, we have seen, and colleagues within this room have tried to take that a step further. What, however, we have, and Jeremy and I certainly felt that we were reading, was that a lot of that is either elaborating the broad concepts of SAF and the potential frameworks, but also the idea of what was happening within, there was often a focus about what was happening within the singular field as well. And we were interested in this concept of activity across multiple fields. And so what we attempted to do was identify tactics and skills to consider the adoption of this and the significance of this multi-field orientation rather than this singular position. And in terms of that, going back to the title, we refer to this as sort of a positional agility or tactical agility, in which the organisations develop the capacity to self-situate dynamically in contrast with the state, but rather than necessarily settling on a single stable position, close or distance from it. So we've seen a lot of the conversations around organisations being too close to the state, arms of the state, or this complete marginalisation. We were interested in kind of the in-between organisations. In terms of the case study, we were looking at the commissioning of children's preventative services, and that was the particular context that we wanted to look at. So we can understand the preventative services as a singular field, but we also then understand that the organisations are occupying multiple fields at that point. So part of the voluntary sector wider, but also part of policy fields as well. And we were interested in how we can potentially look if we can unravel that a little bit. In terms of methodology, Fligstein himself sets the challenge, saying analysts must spend time looking for entrepreneurs and examining their tactics. And we were taking this quite literally and thinking, let's take this forward. So we carried out in-depth, semi-structured interviews with third sector organisations, 23 individuals from senior positions within those organisations, and also with 15 commissioners of those organisations. Our focus was on the tactics of the organisations, but we felt we couldn't take that into consideration without a focus on the others that are influencing that policy field. And in those terms, we included organisations that varied from the very small, from under £10,000 turnover, to those of major, sort of over £10 million turnover. So we had a wide range of that sector, with the one thing all in common, that they were delivering some form of preventative services in partnership with the state in a single local authority area. So they were all present and actors in that field. In terms of taking that forwards then, we first of all identified that before we could start considering this ideas about tactics and how organisations had the opportunity to play out these tactics, there were certain conditions that sit there. And building on previous research and others who are working in our field, we were drawing apart the difference between those more relational driven commissioning approaches that were seen as being much more cooperative and innovative, and allowing these tactics to actually to emerge, versus the much more process driven initiatives which had a much more kind of polarisation of the state and the voluntary sector. And in terms of tactics, when we start talking about the tactics, it's important to note that actually where we could see the enactment of those tactics was much more in these more relationally driven opportunities rather than the process driven. And we'll talk about when organisations were deciding to either take part or withdraw from that. The second condition, I suppose, that we wanted to just recognise was the type of organisations. And we broadly categorised this into three types. We had the conformers, those who we considered to be very close to the state. And there was a quote from one organisation here: "They tell me to jump and I'll ask how high." And that was very much how they considered their relationship with their commissioner. And they elaborated on this for about the whole hour and a half that we were talking to them. To those others that feel like they're in a situation where they don't really have a choice. So another organisation saying that they felt that a change in contract was in breach of their contract and was actually putting them at financial risk, but they felt it was politically unwise to challenge and that they just needed to go with it. And part of this was about also around kind of multiple funding sources and a dependency on that. So we would have categorised them in a conformist situation, but that wouldn't so much be about choice. That's more about the necessity of where they felt they sat at that point. And then the outliers, who absolutely withdrew from these relationships. So they were organisations who were saying, no, we're cutting off our relationship with commissioners, we're not accepting that funding, that isn't what we feel the voluntary sector should be about or what our services should be about. We were particularly interested in these intermediary organisations who we define as sitting outside of that binary distinction and kind of between conformity and dissent, and quite often jumping back and forth between them. And this is where we felt that we could see those social skill tactics playing out. So we identified what we call 4 agility tactics. And in that, the first of these agility tactics was this concept of embracing wide networks. And this was where we found that these organisations were standing out from the others around them. And this was to do with not just embracing organisations formally and informally, but also that were very different from themselves. So certainly, for example, in the conformers, we saw a likelihood of engaging with organisations who were very similar in size, structure and approach. In the intermediary organisations, we saw much more of a tendency of those organisations to engage dissimilar organisations from other proximate fields as well, so not just working within the preventative service. And in terms of doing this ability to form those informal relationships helps them create really practically valuable webs of knowledge that they were able to draw upon very quickly and respond to challenges very quickly. And in terms of an example of this, we saw a single preventative service that was facing potentially a massive reduction in their contract budget. And they were able to explain how they had used this much broader network of organisations to come together very quickly, within around a 24-hour period, to challenge this at a political level. And actually the result of that was that there were changes in the commissioning decision, and they ensured that those reductions didn't take place. And they were absolutely convinced that if they hadn't drawn on that much wider network, and we had some other examples of this. For another good example would be an organisation who they held their annual general meeting, and they gave an example of I think it was around 104 partners that they felt that they worked with across the local authority area. 84 of those partners attended their AGM. A few weeks later, when there was a potential policy change, they were able to mobilise that network very quickly in terms to challenge that policy change. So we saw some examples emerging from the research. The second agility tactic, where we felt that these organisations differentiated themselves, was about this idea of front and backstage relationships. And Mayer and Heemberger talk a little bit about this in terms of foundation trusts, but it was an interesting one to draw upon. So this was about organisations saying that they were developing spaces where they could formally speak to commissioners and formally engage with the state, but they sought out and created opportunities to informally discuss with commissioners and informally discuss with social policy actors, and they ensured that that became a symbiotic relationship in which they were able to offer advice and help shape future tenders and contracts that would come out. And they were quite open with that they would be shaping them within their favour of what they potentially would be able to deliver. They also had and made very public this idea of walking away if they felt it wasn't for them. So if we go back to that concept of conditions, these organisations would walk away from very process-driven processes because they felt that they wouldn't be able to develop that relationship to be able to influence what would be happening within that commissioning process. So again, we saw this with a couple of quotes that we've put here of examples that organisations drew on. And both of these organisations basically are talking about and went on to elaborate how they bypassed the commissioning process. Now, they either massively influenced it at the beginning in terms of it very much being in favour and then successfully secured the contract, or they were able to completely bypass the process and go for a single tender, and actually they felt that they had failed if the things that they wanted to be delivering for the local authority and they wanted to be delivering for commissioners actually ever went out for a tender in a commissioning process. And they were able to give a number of examples and ways in which that they had managed these processes, and that very much came from those front and backstage relationships. We then saw also this idea of diversification, and we were looking at this in the terms of being able to shape the agenda perhaps more subtly and less directly, but through on-the-ground activity. And the examples we can kind of draw on for this would be organisations who went outside of their traditionally delivered field. For example, if they traditionally delivered services within youth service prevention, but then moved into education, and they moved into associated fields, and were able to parachute and deliver into them with a joined up activity, but not necessarily looking like it was joined up on the ground. So what they were talking about was being able to deliver distinct activities which formed part of their narrative. And so an example here of an organisation that entered the education field and a very different policy field as well, to deliver services directly with to schools and bypassing those traditional commissioning relationships. But from this point of view, they were able to secure more funding, but they were also able to influence the policy around preventative services from adjacent policy fields as well, and that became quite powerful for them. But this links really strongly into the fourth tactic, which was almost the wrapping together of all of these, which was about this effective narrativisation. So Quite often in literature, we can talk about this as framing or storytelling. And what this was referring to is being able to weave together their tactics to a comprehensive story that, interestingly, when you went round and interviewed all of these organisations and went back to them, was repeated by other organisations. So it was shared storytelling across the field. And this would reflect that they either felt the organisation had the right values. And where this was particularly interesting was if you compared this to, for example, the organisations who we consider to take more of those conformist ideas. Now, other organisations, when talking about them, if they went into a different field, would talk about them chasing the money, would be talking about them mission drift. And however, these organisations were able to manage that story a little bit better in terms of that not being seen as legitimate activity for them. And organisations, because of their networks, because of them being able to create that shared story, being able to take that forwards. So, in conclusion, we have sought to kind of acknowledge the extremely kind of challenging nature that commissioning is presenting to organisations at this point. But we have hopefully pointed to ways that some organisations, those that we've classified as intermediaries, have been able to navigate that environment with some success. And the significant of linkages that extend well beyond their immediate relationships of providers with the local commissioners of preventative services for children. And so actually it's this multi-dimensional approach that helps strengthen this. And we've considered these sort of manifestations of this positional agility as tactics to help organisations both skillfully move within their field but across fields, and it's this across this multiple field approach where they're selectively being able to take forward emerging opportunities and not just building their resources within a singular field but across multiple arenas. That is helping them be able to move forwards and more advantage in a position of more advantage, but also influence the field that they're in. So it situates change partly within the organisation itself and not just as response to the external factors. And we can see then that the socially skilled actors are able to influence commissioning processes much more in favour towards this relational approach and in favour towards advantaging their own position. And we consider this as kind of we know from previous research that tensions within a field, and we could argue that commissioning is causing some of those tensions at the moment, can give rise to this entrepreneurial activity. And that's what we were really trying to pull out, was what is that entrepreneurial activity looking at? And we conclude with the idea that it's the combination of those triad of factors, the commissioning approach, the voluntary sector response and social skill, which is helping to mobilise certain actors, ideological bias, what they think should be done, over that of others. And potentially we can see this transforming fields. But it does raise questions over leadership of the third sector and kind of those ongoing state and sector relationships. Thank you.